Megyn Kelly's criticism of Meghan Markle didn't land the way a quick late-night punchline lands. Here and gone, useful only for a headline and a few hours of social media noise. What made Kelly's commentary resonate with so many viewers was the sense that it wasn't built on a single accusation or a dramatic new reveal. It was built on accumulation. The structure was simple. Stack Meghan's own public statements beside her subsequent public choices. Let the contrast sit in the open, and then ask the audience to judge whether the story being sold matches the behavior being observed. The segment's force, as many people experienced it, was less about personal dislike and more about a cold, repetitive pattern. A public narrative that asks for trust and sympathy while repeatedly shifting the definitions of privacy, exposure, accountability, and truth depending on what is most useful in the moment. Kelly's framing, in the most direct form, wasn't Meghan is bad. It was Meghan's messaging and Meghan's actions don't line up consistently. That distinction matters because it changes the argument from personality to credibility. Personality debates are endless and subjective. Credibility debates can be tested against public record. Interviews, project announcements, promotional language, legal claims that became public, corporate partnerships that were publicly reported, and the timeline of media appearances that anyone can verify. Whether one likes Megyn Kelly or can't stand her, that method, compare statements to subsequent behavior, works because it does not require blind faith. It requires attention. The way the critique often begins is with Meghan's repeated emphasis on stepping away from attention. In various public appearances over the years, the theme has been consistent. A desire to protect family life, a need for boundaries, a rejection of intrusive media culture, and a stated preference for privacy over spectacle. Kelly's counterpoint, as it's been presented in her commentary, is that the definition of privacy appears to have been re-engineered into something else, selective exposure rather than withdrawal. Not silence, but controlled speech. Not disappearance, but a relocation of the spotlight into more favorable conditions. In that view, the issue isn't that Meghan continued to be public. It's that the rhetoric used to justify being public repeatedly implies the opposite of what is happening in practice. This is where Kelly's approach, whatever one thinks of her tone, feels effective to viewers who already sense something off. She doesn't need to claim secret documents. She doesn't need to introduce anonymous sources. She can simply play a sequence. Statements about wanting distance from media attention followed by high-profile appearances and media projects. Statements about being harmed by exposure followed by professionally produced storytelling that depends on exposure. Statements about refusing the game followed by participation in the game, just with new rules and a new arena. When those clips are organized chronologically, the audience doesn't have to be persuaded with complex analysis. The contrast persuades on its own. A key part of the mockery, what turns critique into a takedown rather than a polite disagreement, is the idea that the audience is being asked to accept a narrative that keeps changing its definitions. Privacy becomes choosing the right platform. Avoiding press becomes producing your own press. Being tired of headlines becomes making the headlines on your schedule. Even the language of restraint can become a form of marketing. The sharpest version of this argument is that the spotlight was never actually rejected. It was simply repackaged. The audience is asked to applaud the repackage as moral growth, rather than seeing it as strategic repositioning. Kelly's segment, in the way people describe it, also leans heavily on the moral vocabulary that has become familiar in Meghan's public branding. Phrases about healing, truth, empowerment, impact, doing the work, protecting others, breaking cycles, and reclaiming narrative. Kelly doesn't necessarily have to argue that such language is always fake. Instead, she questions whether the language is consistently connected to measurable outcomes. In a culture flooded with purpose talk, audiences can become allergic to big moral words that never turn into concrete, verifiable results. The critique becomes, if the rhetoric is always high, why do the outcomes look ordinary? If the claims are always historic, why do the deliverables feel thin? If the messaging is always about service, why does the public footprint look more like celebrity content than like consistent, transparent service? This is where things get complicated, because impact is not always easy to measure and public figures are not required to publish a spreadsheet of every initiative. But Kelly's point, as it comes across, is less about demanding perfection and more about demanding proportion. If you position yourself as an authority because your work is so meaningful, then audiences will reasonably ask what, specifically, the work has produced. When that question goes unanswered and the branding stays loud, skepticism grows. Mockery thrives in that gap because mockery is what audiences use when they feel talked at rather than shown. Another layer of Kelly's criticism revolves around the monarchy itself, and this is often where her lines land hardest with certain audiences. Meghan and Harry have spoken about the emotional damage of royal life, the institutional coldness they felt, and the ways the system allegedly failed them. At the same time, royal association still functions as an unmistakable amplifier in global media, especially in places where royal titles carry social glamour even without legal power. Kelly's argument, stripped of insult, is that there is a selective rejection happening. Reject the institution as harmful, but keep the prestige as useful. She frames that as incompatible. In her harshest phrasing, it becomes, you can't sell the monarchy as trauma while also allowing royal identity to remain a credential that lifts your platform. To a supportive audience, Meghan's continued association with royal status can be seen as unavoidable. She married into a family that the world will always connect her to, whether she likes it or not. To a skeptical audience, the continued use of titles, styles, and royal framing looks like evidence that the separation is not clean. Kelly's mockery is aimed at that perception, that the brand wants the moral victory of leaving, while still benefiting from the glow of what was left behind. Whether that perception is fair is debated, but the perception exists, and Kelly's skill is in naming what many people already suspect in plain language. Kelly also spends time, in her broader commentary on the Sussexes, discussing the business side of the post-royal era. Here, again, the critique doesn't have to depend on rumors. Public reporting has covered major partnerships, media projects, and shifting strategies. Kelly's argument, presented as a pattern rather than a single failure, is that setbacks get framed as persecution instead of being analyzed as normal professional outcomes. Every criticism becomes hate. Every underwhelming reception becomes misinformation. Every tough review becomes a coordinated smear. In that framing, the problem is not that projects succeed or fail. Every creative person has wins and losses. The problem is the reflex to externalize responsibility while continuing to claim moral authority. This is what Kelly means, in effect, when she mocks the professionalization of grievance. The claim is that grievance becomes a renewable resource. It fuels content, it fuels sympathy, it fuels attention, and it can be repackaged endlessly. If your primary product is narrative, then grievance is narrative fuel. And if audiences begin to feel that grievance is being used strategically, especially alongside commercial ventures, fatigue sets in. The mockery lands because many people are already tired of being asked to interpret every negative outcome as proof of injustice, rather than as proof that public life is complicated. One of Kelly's most pointed criticisms, as it's often described, involves control of the environment. She contrasts carefully managed interview settings, friendly platforms, sympathetic hosts, curated themes, with the kind of scrutiny public figures claim to welcome when they say they value truth. Her implication is that credibility is tested under pressure. If authenticity is real, it can survive difficult questions. If a story depends on soft lighting, predictable prompts, and controlled follow-ups, then it starts looking less like truth-telling and more like performance. That idea resonates for a reason. Modern celebrity culture is built on controlled vulnerability. Reveal just enough to look honest, but not enough to lose control. Make it emotional, make it relatable, but keep the frame tight. Kelly's line, whether she says it exactly this way or not in any specific clip, is essentially that authenticity shouldn't need special conditions. Audiences like unscripted reality because it feels risky. They distrust overly polished confessionals because they feel rehearsed. When a public figure repeatedly presents themselves as brave for speaking out, but always chooses venues that won't push back, skeptics see strategy, not courage. Importantly, Kelly's critique doesn't stop at Meghan. She often directs part of the blame at the media itself. Celebrity journalism, she argues, tends to trade skepticism for access. Outlets repeat narrative-friendly biographical details without doing the hard work of verification. They prioritize emotion over specificity. They frame claims as truth because framing them as truth keeps the interview relationship smooth. In that sense, Kelly positions her takedown not merely as an attack on Meghan, but as an attack on the ecosystem that built a protected bubble around certain narratives and punished anyone who asked basic questions. This matters because it broadens the segment's appeal. Some viewers don't like Kelly, but still agree with her complaint about media culture. Others don't care about Meghan but care about hypocrisy and image management. Others simply enjoy the feeling of someone saying what you can't say without apology. That's how a critique becomes viral. It gives multiple groups a reason to share it, even if they disagree on motives. The public reaction to segments like this is usually polarized, but there has been a noticeable shift in how polarization expresses itself. In earlier waves of debate, criticism of Meghan often triggered immediate moral framing. If you criticize her, you must be part of a hateful mob. Over time, that framing has weakened for some audiences because skepticism has become more mainstream. People can now say, "I believe she faced unfair treatment, and I still think her storytelling is inconsistent." That both things can be true stance is exactly what makes critiques like Kelly's more dangerous to a brand, because it removes the easiest defense. If skepticism is no longer automatically coded as prejudice, then skepticism becomes harder to dismiss. Kelly's commentary often includes a strategic move here, acknowledging that Meghan likely faced real hostility in media coverage, including cruel and unfair treatment, while insisting that real hostility does not erase contradictions or create immunity from scrutiny. This concession is important because it blocks the simplest rebuttal. If she denies all unfairness, she looks dishonest. If she acknowledges unfairness but continues with her critique, she looks like she's targeting inconsistency rather than identity. That is why the segment can feel, to certain viewers, less like bullying and more like a harsh audit. A major reason the critique sticks is that it is easy to summarize. You said you wanted privacy, then you built a career on high-profile exposure. You say you want authenticity, but everything is controlled. You say you want impact, but the results are hard to see. These are not complicated arguments. They are shorthand arguments, and shorthand arguments are the ones that become reference points. Once a shorthand enters culture, everything gets filtered through it. Every new project gets measured against it. Every new statement gets compared to older ones. That is how reputations shift, not by one scandal, but by one simple frame that becomes sticky. This is where the silence after such a segment becomes part of the story. Silence can be wise when a claim is baseless or vague. But when a critique is built on specific, publicly accessible examples, silence can look like avoidance. And Meghan's public identity has often been associated with speaking up, correcting narratives, and defending her truth. When someone is known for being vocal and suddenly chooses quiet, the quiet feels selective. To supporters, it can look dignified. To skeptics, it can look like the critique landed too close to reality to argue with cleanly. To neutral observers, it can look like there's no easy counterstory. Media strategists often note that silence is rarely neutral in the current environment. If you respond emotionally, you validate the fight. If you don't respond at all, you let the critique sit unchallenged. The only way to truly neutralize a records-based critique is with records-based clarity. Specific explanations, consistent timelines, or demonstrable outcomes. But that kind of response is hard because it requires specificity, and specificity reduces flexibility. Brands love flexibility. Public trust loves specificity. That tension is at the heart of why these controversies keep resurfacing. Another aspect of Kelly's commentary that resonates is the way it casts Prince Harry as increasingly secondary in the public brand. Not because he is irrelevant, but because the messaging often positions Meghan as the driver of the narrative direction. In a couple brand, audiences look for a clear center of gravity. If Meghan appears to be the strategist, deciding the tone, the projects, the positioning, then critics will place coherence demands on her. That's not necessarily fair to either person, but it's how public perception works. The leader gets blamed when the story feels unstable. The long-term consequences of a viral takedown aren't just emotional, they can be commercial. Partners, platforms, collaborators, and brands pay attention to volatility and fatigue. They don't just measure popularity, they measure risk. If a public figure becomes a magnet for polarized reaction, every partnership becomes a gamble. Kelly's critique, because it organizes scattered doubts into a single narrative of inconsistency, can serve as a convenient reference point for future skeptics. It turns loose discomfort into a coherent label. Once a label sticks, inconsistent, rebranding, performative, controlled, it becomes difficult to outrun because each new move is interpreted through that lens. This is also where the cultural significance of mockery comes in. Mockery is not just mean laughter. Mockery is what people do when they no longer treat a story as sacred. For a time, Meghan functioned not only as a celebrity but as a symbol in larger conversations. Modern monarchy, institutional power, public empathy, race, gender, media ethics. Symbol status can create a protective bubble where criticism feels morally risky. When a major commentator mocks the symbol openly, it signals that the bubble is weakening. It tells other commentators, "You can say this now." It changes the rules of what feels permissible. Once that permission spreads, the posture of coverage shifts. The figure becomes a standard celebrity subject again. Assessed, questioned, joked about, measured against outcomes. That shift is hard to reverse because it is not driven by one person. It becomes a cultural habit. It also changes what audiences expect. If the culture decides you are fair game, then the burden increases. You must either become more consistent, more transparent, or more willing to face tough questions without framing every challenge as persecution. Kelly's closing message, in the cleanest interpretation, is always the same. Public trust depends on alignment between words and actions. People can forgive mistakes, messy seasons, even failed projects. What they struggle to forgive is contradiction presented as principle. When contradiction becomes routine, mockery fills the space where credibility used to sit. That is why the segment had staying power beyond the moment. It didn't introduce a new scandal. It organized a feeling many people already had. Whether one sees Kelly's tone as harsh, entertaining, necessary, or cruel, the reason the critique travels is not primarily her personality. It's the structure of her argument. She doesn't ask viewers to hate Meghan. She asks them to notice. Notice the timeline. Notice the phrasing. Notice how definitions shift. Notice how privacy gets used as a shield and then redefined as a brand feature. Notice how moral language grows louder when measurable outcomes remain vague. Notice how the story always seems to have a built-in excuse when public response is less than flattering. And that is why the takedown, as described by people who share it, can feel more like a cross-examination than like a random rant. Cross-examinations work by repetition, not by drama. They work by letting a pattern reveal itself. The most damaging critique is often not, "You did one bad thing." It is, "You keep doing the same kind of thing, and you keep asking us to interpret it differently each time." In an era of branding, storytelling, and curated identity, nothing is more dangerous than a simple, repeatable frame that makes the audience feel they finally understand what they're looking at. Megyn Kelly did not invent public skepticism about Meghan Markle. That skepticism existed before any one segment, fueled by years of headlines, interviews, projects, and shifting public narratives. What Kelly did, at least in the way her supporters and even some neutral viewers describe it, was condense that skepticism into a clear, shareable argument and deliver it in a way that felt anchored to public material rather than to whispers. The mockery landed because it didn't rely on one explosive claim. It relied on accumulation. It relied on the audience recognizing the pattern for themselves. And once a large enough audience believes it recognizes a pattern, the conversation changes. The story is no longer about whether people like you. It becomes about whether they believe you.